I look today. It's okay.
All right. Okay, welcome everyone. We'll just wait a few minutes while everyone is pouring into the room. Thank you for joining us today. Okay, as everyone's joining us, I'll just let you know that we don't have the chat function enabled for the webinar today, but you are able to use the Q&A. So if you want to ask a question of Sonya as we're going through the presentation, you can pop it in there and I will facilitate a Q&A for us at the end. And for those of you who are keen on learning more about the collection, we're also going to be recording this session. So if you want to come back and watch it again, you can feel free to do that at a later date. We'll just give everyone a few more minutes to join us. And while Sonya is more in a full screen and not just a speaker function, you can enjoy the lovely gallery of artwork behind her.
The artist is a wonderful artist named Bennett Jones, who is my 7-year-old son. Actually, there's some of his younger sister in there too. So
it's beautiful. We at the RMG, the team has really loved watching this gallery grow over the last year. It's been great.
It goes all the way over there, and it's now taking over some closet doors here as well. But my office is in my son's room, so I always tell people that this is his domain, that he's letting me in, so he gets to decorate it as he wants.
It's awesome. It's awesome. All right, well, we'll get started. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Culture Chats at Lunch. For those of you who I haven't met yet, my name is Lauren Gould, and I'm the CEO at the Robert McLaughlin Gallery. It's a pleasure to meet all of you through Zoom if we haven't met yet. This series, Culture Chats at Lunch, is a collaboration between the Canadian Automotive Museum, the Ontario Regiment Museum, the Oshawa Museum, Oshawa Public Libraries, Parkwood Estate, and the Robert McLaughlin Gallery. And since March, we've been bringing you a session every Friday at lunchtime, and thought this was a great way for all of Oshawa's galleries, libraries, archives, and museums to actively engage with the community through the pandemic. And we see this series in particular as an opportunity for us to share stories with both our faithful audiences and to new audiences as well, through fun, accessible talks and programs intended to support connection and well-being, which we all know is becoming more and more important as the days go by. As organizations all located in the city of Oshawa, we also collectively understand and appreciate the importance of positioning ourselves on this land. You may be joining us from elsewhere today, and if you are, I encourage you to visit native-land.ca to understand the Indigenous history and languages of where you live. We acknowledge that Oshawa, the land on which we live, learn, work, and play, is located on the treaty land of the Mississaugas of the Scugog Island Nation and the traditional territories of the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat, and Anishinaabe. Today, our Indigenous communities continue to contribute to the life of this city and to celebrate their heritage, practice traditions, and care for the land and waterways as sacred. And we see understanding this as vital to our own learning and our work towards reconciliation. So today, I'm so happy to be joined by Sonya Jones, our Curator of Collections, who has an exceptional and deep knowledge of our permanent collection, as well as the local and regional art scene. Sonya is going to be sharing our Stories Behind the Art Part 2. She's been at the RMG since 2008, and prior to the RMG, she worked for a private art dealer in Toronto, the Canadian Heritage Information Network, and Carleton University Art Gallery. She has curated over 65 collection-based exhibitions at the RMG, which is truly remarkable. And she lives in Oshawa with her husband and 2 kids and just loves talking about the collection. And I know she's going to infuse her love of the RMG and our collection to all of you as well. So you can join me in welcoming Sonya. And as I mentioned, we will have some time for Q&A towards the end of our session, so feel free to submit those questions at any time throughout the presentation. And if you're having any tech issues as well, you can pop those in the Q&A and I will do my best to help you out. So over to you, Sonya.
Okay, great. Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm just going to get my presentation up. Thanks for joining me on this very cold and windy day. Let me just get this going. There we go. Can you see that, Lauren? Okay.
Yep,
So great. So thanks so much for joining me today. I know that you heard from Valerie and Heather about some stories based on some wonderful exhibitions that they curated not too long ago. So this one is more about works that are in our vault and in our collection and the stories associated with them. So art is such a subjective thing. You can look at a work and it might confuse you, or it makes you uncomfortable, or you might just not like it. But I find that over the years of giving tours of exhibitions at the RMG, that once you kind of share stories, it offers different perspective and meanings behind the work that could generate a different appreciation for it. And that's because storytelling is just such a powerful and a way to kind of connect people with art, and it's such an effective tool when talking about art. And so this presentation is about some interesting facts, interesting stories about the artists themselves, or just entertaining stories about some of the works that are in our collection. And if you think about some of the collection that are some of the artworks in the world that are the most famous works in the world, it's because of these stories and interesting things that people continue to study and continue to fascinate us. And we have some of those works in our collection that kind of continue to fascinate me after all these years of working with the collection. So just first a little bit about the collection. We have over 4,700 artworks that are historical, modern, and contemporary art, and our exhibition programming really reflects that. So in normal times, we usually have about 5 permanent collection shows a year at the gallery. Right now, you can explore the collection through virtual RMG, so I'll share a little bit more about that later, but I encourage you guys to explore the collection that way as well. But for today, I'm going to share some interesting stories about the collection. And this is just some of our exhibitions. So starting off with discoveries and interesting stories. And some of these stories aren't necessarily related to the artworks themselves, but are interesting stories about the artists, and really give you a sense of who the creator of these works are. So starting off with this work by Antoine Sebastian Plamondon called St. Charles Borromeo. Plamondon was a really important historical Quebec artist who is best known for his portraits and religious paintings. And the RMG actually has 3 works of his in our collection, this one being probably the most important, and not to mention the largest out of the 3. It's 6 feet tall and 3 feet wide. So it depicts the 16th century figure, St. Charles Borromeo. And when it was received into the collection, it was slightly water damaged and in really need of a good cleaning. So what the gallery didn't know about this work was that there was more to it than met the eye. So while doing research about this work, it was discovered that an art dealer who had sold the painting to the Loeb family had found the painting rolled up, collecting dust in a basement of an old church in Quebec. And he realized that it was assigned to Plamondon. So he bought it from the church, and then he later sold it to the Loeb family. So now this is where it gets a little interesting. So when the gallery first received this painting, St. Charles was actually holding a scroll. So here's a black and white picture of it when it came in with the scroll. So while doing research, the gallery reached out to this art dealer, and he actually told us that when he found it in this church rolled up, St. Charles was holding a crucifix, not a scroll. So from the time that he found it in the church basement and to the time that it came into our hands, it was changed. It was painted over to with this scroll that you see in the black and white picture. So in 1992, the RMG had the Canadian Conservation Institute X-ray and clean the painting to reveal the original painting underneath. And sure enough, there was the crucifix that had been painted over. And the crucifix really does suit the story of St. Charles much better than the scroll, because in 1575, the saint went to Milan where people were dying of the plague. And the story goes that he was so distressed by what he saw that he walked through the streets of the city holding up a crucifix in the hopes of driving out the plague. So there's a bit of mystery as to why this was painted over, but one theory in the artwork file is that it didn't suit the belief system, and so it was changed. But this is a really good example of how much an artwork can change over time. So people can add things to it. The title might change, but this is a really good example of kind of how a painting might change as it kind of goes through different ownership. Another mystery about this painting is how this plamondon became into the church's basement, because it's a 6 feet tall painting. Apparently it was way too big for the size of the wall space in this very small church, but also plamondon at the time that it was found would have been worth a lot of money. And so how this church was able to afford a plamondon, but there's probably the chances that they didn't quite know what they had at the time. But nevertheless, we're just so pleased to have it in the collection, and it still fascinates and gives a wonderful mystery to it. So another example of a painting that through the work of conservation, more was discovered about it is this work by E. Wiley Greer called Children's Party from 1910. So Greer was born in Australia, but his family moved to England and then came to Canada in 1876. Greer was actually knighted in 1935 while still president of the Royal Canadian Academy. And he often used his family as inspiration. So this, in this impressionist manner, Greer has captured this wonderful special moment of his the 12th birthday of his daughter Stella. And the two boys that are on either side of him are her brothers, Crawford and Geoffrey. So this painting really, just as a object that tells us something about history, shows us what these festive events would have been like, right? Like there's party crackers, there's party hats, there's different fruit, oranges, pears, and grapes. But like I mentioned before, the discovery of this painting was more of what happened through conservation after it was gifted to us. So it was discovered that 15.5 inches of the painting, so basically the top half of the painting where the night sky is, was actually rolled up and hidden behind the frame of the work. And so this could be easily explained as the owners didn't have a frame that was quite big enough, and they just used a frame that they already had. And so when it was unrolled, this amazing night sky and window added so much to this painting. It gave a sense of space of the room. It gave us a sense of time of day, but also this beautiful constellation in the sky. But what also was discovered underneath this part of the canvas that was tucked away behind the frame was actually the name of the children. So who was actually depicted in the painting? So this wonderful discovery that gives so much more context and meaning to the painting that was actually written on the back of it. So what you're seeing here is 3 different portraits that we have in the collection by the same artist, all of the same gentleman. So this is 3 portraits by Harold Towne of Joseph H. Bauer. And so anyway, I just want to make sure I didn't put them on separate slides because the story kind of connects them all, but they're all called the same work. So Harold Towne is an artist known for his booming personality and his passion for abstraction. He was a member of the first Ontario Abstract Collective, Painters 11, that some of you might know has a special connection to this community and to the RMG's collecting and education mandate. Is that they were actually founded at the cottage of Oshawa-based artist Alexander Luke, a member of the McLaughlin family's cottage on Thixon Point on the boundary of Whitby and Oshawa. And we actually have 91 works by Harold Towne in our collection. And these are 3 examples of portraits by him that we have. So although he was best known as an abstract artist, he once did this interview with a reporter who asked him, "Can an abstract painter do a good portrait?" And Towne's response was, and I'm going to read this in quotes, "In the slick portraiture of the classic tradition, no great portraits have been done since Sargent, but the best that have been done by abstract painters like Picasso and Graham Sutherland." So then the reporter had a follow-up question for him. "How about you? Can you do a portrait?" So Towne's response, after telling a story that I'm going to share shortly, is, "I'm so good at portraits, it frightens me." I just love this quote so much. It really paints Harold Towne's personality. But now for the story of how these portraits came to be. So in the 1950s, Towne received a portrait commission from a wealthy Bay Street businessman named Joseph Bauer, whom Harold always called Mr. Blue, as in blue chip. Bauer would visit Towne at his studio for sittings, and this process of doing these different portraits stretched out for 5 months, because every sitting ended with dinner and drinks at a first-class restaurant, which of course Mr. Blue generously paid for. Bauer was so impressed with Towne's work that he gave him full freedom to keep exploring and keep painting portraits until Towne felt like it was finished. So in the end, Towne did 5 oils of Bauer before he felt like he had exhausted the subject. So at this time, Towne was really a struggling artist, and so this was a huge commission for him. So when the time came for him to deliver the work, he couldn't afford a delivery service. So the story goes that he strapped the painting to roller skates and rolled the painting down Bay Street to the Bay Street office to deliver it. And then later, Towne discovered that he actually had a hole in the back of his pants when he was in this fancy Bay Street building delivering the painting. So after delivery, he actually asked Bauer for investment advice. And Bauer reportedly responded, this is a quote, "Buy a good suit, then when the crash comes, you won't look like a bum." So Towne listened to this advice and would eventually buy 3 suits. And according to the author Iris Knoll, who had a personal relationship with Harold Towne, they ended up being the only 3 suits he ever owned in his lifetime. So I just love this story of delivering paintings on roller skates to the fancy Bay Street area, and just this relationship between the subject of the painting and the artist. And carrying on with that theme of the sitter and the artist relationship is this beautiful painting by Marlene Hilton Moore of the artist Doris McCarthy. So Hilton Moore had done a series of portraits featuring Canadian artists. And so of course, some of you probably know that Doris McCarthy was an incredible landscape painter. So it looks like an ordinary portrait, a part of her series, but it actually tells a really interesting story. And the first is that, and I'll give you a hint, the back of the painting actually has tire marks on it. So I'll get to that story in a minute. But also this little white pin that is on Doris's sweater in the picture tells an interesting story about the relationship between the sitter and the artist. So I'll start from the beginning of the story though. So Hilton Moore approached Doris McCarthy about sitting for a portrait, and at first McCarthy was really reluctant. So in a letter about the painting, Doris wrote, quote, "I was appalled at the prospect of wasting 12 hours of my precious time sitting around talking about art. I had all too little time to do it, which interested me far more than talking about it." End quote. But in the end, she agreed, but she had a condition. She agreed to sit for the portrait as long as she can continue writing her biography while she sat. So it's the same thing. This is a long process of doing a portrait, and the two of them developed a really lovely friendship throughout the process and really enjoyed their time together. So now for the story of how tire marks ended up on the back of the painting. So Hilton Moore had been commuting from Barrie, where she lived, to the Scarborough Bluffs, where Doris McCarthy lived. And one day, as she turned off the highway, a gust of wind caught the corner of the canvas in the back of her truck at just the right angle, sending the canvas flying onto the road, where it was immediately run over by a car. So the stretcher was broken and the front of the canvas was damaged. And she arrived at Doris's house and was obviously really distraught and upset at the fact that this happened. And through this, relationship, they realized that the damage wasn't irreparable. And so they fixed the front of it, and then the tire marks just had to remain on the back. And obviously they fixed the stretcher. So the other interesting detail about this work is the little pin that I mentioned earlier that's on her sweater. So when the time came for Hilton Moore to present the final portrait to Doris McCarthy, she told Hilton Moore that she loved it, but she was disappointed that she didn't include the white snowflake pin that she always wore on her sweater. And the pin was actually really special to the artist because it was a pin that represented her membership to the Order of Canada. And so through this lovely relationship and exchange between sitter and artist, Hilton Moore just quickly added the pin, and then Doris was happy with the final product. And then another story about the sitter and the artist kind of relationship is this beautiful painting by Frederick Varley called Character Study of Mrs. Surrey. So Frederick Varley was a Canadian painter and a founding member of the Group of Seven. So he was a very good landscape painter, but he's probably best known for his portrait paintings. And they were usually of people that he had strong emotional attachment to, like friends or family or people that were important to his life. And the subject of this painting is Mrs. Surrey, who Varley lived with for a short time in his life. So Philip Surrey, who is the son of the sitter of this painting, wrote that while staying for 2 months with his mother and himself in Philip's apartment at Tupper Street in Montreal, Fred Varley painted 3 portraits of his mother, Mrs. Surrey. But she did not like any of them. Her son says that the paintings are actually a really good likeness to her, but she didn't think that they were flattering enough for her. And so the story of how much she hated these portraits is quite amusing, because Philip and Fred Varley were one day having a beer in the kitchen together and talking when they heard a strange sound come from the other room. And apparently the 2 men looked at each other and both said at the same time, "She's scraping off the portrait." And they ran into the other room to discover that the portrait was actually untouched. But it's a funny story because it just shows and illustrates just how much she hated this portrait, because that was the first thing they thought of when they heard a strange sound coming from the other room. But we love this portrait and we're so happy to have it in the gallery. And it's one of 9 works that we have of Varley in our collection. So another work that has these wonderful stories behind it that is an important work in the collection is this work by William Kerelik called Children's Fantasy. So Kerelik was a well-known Canadian Ukrainian artist. And this painting that you see here with these kind of white marks blocked out here is because this was actually a mural that he painted on his kitchen wall. So he painted this mural in 1969 when his children were 1, 4, and 6 years old, and he painted it directly on their kitchen wall. And so here's a picture of it when it was in the kitchen. So you can see that first blanked out spot is like a pass through to the dining room, and then this other blank spot was for a cupboard. And you can see this as a composite picture to get the full view. So he painted this really with his children in mind and his family in mind, and he was inspired by Ukrainian folklore and children's stories. But then he would take these children's stories and kind of personalize them to reflect his own family. So for example, this cloud here that's raining donuts, this was something that he added because donuts were his children's favorite treat. So I'm just going to share some more pictures of some of the details. So another thing that is that it remained in the kitchen until 1989. And then Mrs. Kerelik had it removed by professional conservators and placed in the family dining room. And so this shows it in the dining room, and that's how it came into the gallery's collection. So here's some details. They're in black and white because they're from the file when it was taken in the house. So this piece of paper here, spanking the young child, is actually a list of dinner table rules. So some of the rules that it lists is like no elbows on the table, don't speak when adults are talking, no whining, no pouting, no singing at the table. So there was this kind of humor to it all as well, but very whimsical and filled with kind of things that children would just be extremely captivated by. And as I mentioned, I'm just going to go back to this picture of it. It's obviously in the gallery's collection, and some of you might remember because it was installed for about 10 years right outside where the gallery's studio spaces are where children's programs took place. And my office at the time was located in that area. And for years, I would see these group of classes sitting in front of this mural, and they were just they were captivated. They could talk about it for so long, and it is truly a really wonderful work that engages children. But from experience, I also witnessed a lot of adults that would stand for just staring at it, mesmerized, looking at all the different hidden images inside of it. And it's a very different work for Kerelik. Not only is it a softer pastel palette than what we're used to seeing of his work, but what makes it so unique is that it wasn't meant for the public. It wasn't meant for exhibition or sale. This was a work that he did specifically for his family and for his children. And so the gallery feels truly honored and lucky to have it in the collection, and it was gifted by the family. I'm just going to move ahead to the next slide. So this is another kind of heavy hitter in our collection. Some of you might recognize it because it too was on display for over 10 years that you could see this painting for a long, long time. And it's a painting by Sir Alfred James Munnings, and he was really known as one of England's finest horse painters. And he was also a very outspoken critic of modernism. He was known to outwardly speak out against artists like Picasso and Matisse, saying things like, "What are pictures for? To fill a man's soul with admiration and sheer joy, not to bewilder and daze him." So he was often writing publicly in criticisms of the modernist movements. Except interestingly, if you look at this painting, there's a lot of Impressionism in it, and Impressionism was a modern movement in art. You could see it in the grass and especially in the wonderful sky. So going back to his love of horses, he had a great love of horses, and he spoke at length about his love for the start of a race. So not the end of a race, but the start of a race. So when the horses are milling around, waiting to get let loose into the race, nostrils flaring, adrenaline flowing, for him, it was always about the start and that excitement that you would feel at the start of the race versus the finish and the results. So this painting was actually sold to E.P. Taylor, who owned the property that would become Winfield Farms. And as some of you might know, Winfield Farms was a significant part of Oshawa's history, having produced world-famous racehorses. One thing I just love about this painting is if you look at the dates of the painting of how long it took him to create this. This was a 14-year labor of love. In a letter to E.P. Taylor about this painting, he wrote, "I have never done such a work before, nor shall I do one again." So again, it's one of those wonderful things that knowing that how special this work was to the artist and this connection to the community, it makes it a really special work in our collection. So I mentioned earlier that some of the stories are more evolving around the artists themselves and what fascinates us about the artists versus specifically about the artwork. And this is a wonderful example of that. So this is another very important work in our collection, probably our most important international example in our collection by Lionel Feininger called High Houses 3. So Lionel Feininger was a German-American painter that, like many artists of his time, was really drawn to Paris, and which as a center of artistic creativity. And what we're seeing here is actually a Paris street. And Feininger's cubist approach to this painting turns kind of this linear scene of what you would imagine when you think of Parisian apartment buildings into this kind of complex and maze-like world. So as I said, it's a really important work to our collection that was gifted to us by our important patron, Isabel McLaughlin. So while it's a really great example of cubism, it's really the story about Feininger that we usually kind of frame this work in terms of captivating people about the story about the artist himself. So it's about what happened to Feininger with the rise of Nazi Germany. And so during the rise of Nazi power in Germany, the Nazi power declared his work to be degenerate in 1936. In 1937, the Nazis organized the Degenerate Art exhibition. It included over 650 works of art that were confiscated from German museums by the Nazis. Degenerate art was defined as works that, this is a quote, "insult German feeling or destroy or confuse natural form or simply reveal an absence of adequate manual and artistic skill." So they put together this exhibition of what they deemed basically inappropriate art and dangerous art. And 1 million people attended this exhibition over a period of 6 weeks. Lionel Feininger's work, not the work that we have in our collection, but his work was featured in this exhibition pretty predominantly. And so his work kind of being included in the show gave him kind of this notoriety. The exhibition actually followed another exhibition earlier in the year called Great German Art Exhibition, which showcased modern art that was approved by the Nazis. So while modern styles of art were prohibited, the Nazis promoted paintings and sculptures that were traditional in manner and that exalted the, quote, blood and soil values of racial purity, the military, and obedience. So they did this after that. So these two kind of comparing what is appropriate to them and what is not appropriate to them. So what happened to artists that were labeled degenerate? And so what happened to them is that some of them had sanctions on them that included being dismissed from teaching positions, being forbidden to exhibit or to sell their art, and in some cases being forbidden to produce any art at all. So thankfully, Feininger left Germany in 1936, the year his work was deemed degenerate. He left. But before this exhibition happened, that would really cement his reputation in Nazi Germany. So now to kind of talk about where inspiration comes from, because some of the stories behind the artwork in our collection kind of explains, where the inspiration for the work comes from. And, we can all be inspired by different things you see, people in your life, just history, your own personal experiences. So it's really fascinating to see what inspires artists to create their work. Just watching my time. So this first work is by Louis de Niveville. It's called Early Morning. He was born in England and grew up in Montreal as one of 12 brothers and sisters. He had a huge family. When he was 6 years old, he was hospitalized for 5 years due to spinal tuberculosis. So he really attributes a lot of his kind of fantasy that he puts in his work to this time that he stayed 5 years in bed, fantasizing as a child, because that was pretty much all he had to do when he was in this hospital. So his work really explores memories, observations and dreams, fantasy, and is very, very surreal in nature. So this painting was inspired by two things, a magazine advertisement and a memory of car rides with his father. So he wrote about this work and the advertisement that he saw, which was one for small cars. The ad had 3 cars parked on a curb, and it said, "Do you feel squeezed?" And then obviously there was a technical trick to make all these cars look really squashed in it. And at this time that he was looking at this picture in the magazine, de Niveville was really drawn to perspective. He was playing around with perspective. So he cut it out of the magazine and then put it away as something to revisit later. And so one day he pulls it out of his file and he describes feeling ready for it, ready for this exploration that he was going to do. He also wrote about memories of car rides with his father. So I'll read a passage of what he said about his memory and this artwork. So this is a fairly long quote, but it really gives you a sense of who the artist was and how he thinks and explains his work. So as a child, my father used to take us for car rides, and as you're driving by, you see something but never see it long enough to really know exactly what it is that's happening. So you see it in your mind. You make up what is happening. In a way, it sets off fantasies of strange kinds of happenings. This painting is what it's all about. It's a sort of glimpse of life, a glimpse of something, and you're not quite sure what it is. And then you make up what is missing. And very often it's more interesting than what is actually there. It's a landscape, but within this landscape, there's something that is a bit strange happening. So that's him really describing his interest in surrealism and kind of this idea of what goes on in your mind when you see things. And so, you think of driving by in a car and things kind of go by quickly. And I remember as a kid seeing like large boulders in the mountains of the Rockies and being convinced that I just saw a black bear or something like that. So it's much more interesting in your mind than what it is in real life. So another really big important work in our collection is this work by Emily Carr called Wood Interior. She was a Canadian artist and writer who was inspired by the Indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest coast. She was one of the first painters in Canada to adopt a modernist and post-impressionist style. but she didn't really receive any recognition for her work until she changed subject matter from Indigenous scenes to landscapes, forest scenes in particular, like we're seeing here. So while she wasn't a member of the Group of Seven, she corresponded with Lauren Harris, a member of the Group of Seven, about art. So they would send each other kind of advice and talk about art together through correspondences. In one of their letter exchanges, Harris suggests that she focus on the forest and nature and not so much on totem poles, because she was painting a lot of totem poles at the time. He said that the totem pole is a work of art in itself and that her focus should be on form, light, and color and nature. And so this is one of the first paintings that she painted in response. So you can really see that she is focusing on form, light, and nature. And then on this same slide, you can see that she was also a writer. She wrote poetry. And this work, this poem is thought to be about this painting. So again, and reading this poem, you really get transferred into the painting through senses. So what seest thou, what hearest thou, what smellest thou, what feelest thou, what tastest thou, as you can see and read through this poem. So this painting is a really important work in her practice. It really demonstrates a shift and that was an important shift for her artistic practice. And so it's one that gets loaned out a lot. And in fact, this work is in Germany at the moment, because you can't really talk about Emily Carr's work without including this work because of how important it is to her overall practice. And in terms of what Emily Carr was doing with art and that lack of recognition at the time of how she was pushing modernism in Canada. So Isabel McLaughlin who gifted us this work, wrote that she had just returned from working in Paris and being really familiar with the trends that were happening at the kind of epicenter of artistic creativity at the time, Paris. And she came across this painting at the CNE, the Exhibition of Canadian Paintings, and it really struck out to her as a considerable force, she described it, sharply in contrast to what she was seeing in Paris. So she describes it as being a breath of fresh, invigorating air, totally different from anything that she was seeing in Paris in this modernist movement. And so she purchased this work, and we're really, really lucky to have it in the collection because of Isabel McLaughlin. So probably one of the most visible works in our collection, as it's in the front of our building and everybody can see it anytime you drive by, is this work by Douglas Copeland called Group Portrait 1957. Copeland is an internationally renowned artist and author, and we approached him in the spring of 2010 to produce a sculpture for the exterior of the RMG. And he was actually really excited to work with us because he actually had a personal relationship with Arthur Erickson, who was the architect of the 1987 expansion of the building. But also he had a keen interest in mid-century modernism and the work of Painters 11. So he was really interested in the RMG as an organization and its collection. So through the process of him putting together this proposal, he asked us to supply images of Painters 11 works, the most important works by each member, as well as a history of the building, a history of the collection, and basically sharing archival material during his inspiration of this work. So he was inspired by this very famous photographic portrait of Painters 11 taken by Peter Croydon in 1957. And this photograph really sets the framework of what you're seeing on the side of the building. Because he later, you'll see it, he places these transponders on top of the faces of each member of Painters 11. And how he did that is that through asking us to provide images of the most important kind of key works by each member of Painters 11, he broke those paintings down to kind of their primary colors and then created this kind of this transponder, this idea of kind of transmitting Painters 11 into our contemporary world and into our contemporary reality. So that's kind of what those transponders are meant for. So then those are placed on top of the faces of each members of Painters 11, and then you can see the final result on our building. So I find, especially with this work, that gets a lot of visibility when people are like wondering what it is. They're, like, oh, there's targets on the side of the building. Once you tell them that story and that connection connection to the history of the RMG, the history of the community, and its connection to Painters 11, they have a whole new appreciation for this work and its importance to the community. Just gonna go ahead. So the next couple of works I'm going to talk about are inspiration, like less about inspiration, I'd say, and more about how titles can really allude to what, well, it is inspiration, allude to what the inspired and what the subject of this painting, the paintings are. And they're two abstract paintings that I'll be showing you. And when you think of abstract paintings, if people are familiar with them, they're often untitled, or they have kind of generic titles like shapes and forms or something like that. But there is some abstract paintings that their title really alludes to a meaning, or kind of directs the viewer to have an experience with the work and kind of understand it in a different way, whereas untitled works kind of leaves you to explore freely on your own. So this work, again by Towne, who I talked about earlier with those 3 portraits, this is called The Fence. As I mentioned earlier, he was a member of the Painters 11, but he was a prolific painter, and he would often work in series, large series. And when he talks about this work, he describes this work as a standalone, something that he just had to do that doesn't really fit into any of the series that he was exploring throughout his career. And so the story about where this came from, the inspiration, it was quite literally a fence. So he was walking down Parliament Street in Toronto, and he came across a fence that had been knocked down at some point and then reassembled, so that the advertisement that was painted on the boards no longer made any graphic sense. And the image really stayed in his mind for several days. He couldn't escape this image that was staying with him. And so he decided that he just needed to paint it, and so that he could get rid of this image in his head. So that's why it's a standalone in his practice. And it's a really great example of artistic process. So like, not unlike writers who sometimes have an idea and they just need to put that idea down on paper, this is an example of an artist that had this vision and this inspiration that he just needed to put down on canvas. So that's a really good example of something very simple, inspiring an artist, and especially an abstract artist. And another example of that is by another member of Painters 11, Tom Hodgson. And this one, as the title suggests, is a portrait of a shirt. And what happened is that he was wearing this shirt one day, and he was in a men's washroom that had pink walls, and he was super taken with the odd color combination that was happening. And so he decided to bring it out in a painting. So here's actually a photo of him wearing the shirt that inspired the color combination that when he was in this pink walled bathroom that inspired this painting. So again, another example of just needing to get an inspiration down and this image and exploration of color that he needed to do because he found it so fascinating and interesting. And just a fun fact about Tom Hodgson's, pardon me, was that he was something that often people don't know, is that he was actually also a canoeer, and he represented Canada at the Olympics in Helsinki in 1952 and Melbourne Olympics in rowing and canoeing for Olympics. So just a fun fact about one of the artists in the Painters 11 that some people don't often know. So in conclusion, we have so many works in the collection, and I could go on and on and on about different stories, but this gives you kind of a good glimpse of some of the most key works in our collection and their stories that really bring them to life. But this is something that I love talking about, and I love sharing stories about the collection. And what I love about it is that the collection is just such an engaging way. We have this incredible resource right here in Oshawa, and I just love engaging the community with the collection. And right now in our current state, that's really hard to do. So that one way that we're encouraging people to kind of experience our programming is through virtual RMG. If you go to our website, you'll see virtual RMG. Here you can explore our collections, online virtual tours of the exhibition spaces, as well as different art activities and artist talks, and experience some of our online exhibitions as well that are based on the collection. So I encourage everyone to take the time to explore virtual RMG while we're remain closed at this time, but because the collection is something that should be enjoyed by the community for sure. And that's it for me, Lauren.
Thank you so much, Sonya. That was really amazing. I know I always really appreciate learning more about the collection because I have only been at the gallery for a year, which is just like a little drop in the water when it comes to learning about a collection at any institution that one might join. So I always learn more whenever I listen to one of your talks too. So thank you. And I think you touched on something really important, which is just the importance of storytelling to art. And that's really a way that we can both engage with the art and find a way to relate to it. Because I think that, you know, art of any kind can seem elusive or sort of, you know, unattainable to so many of us, but we all know stories, we all have stories. And I think learning about some of these stories through sessions like this really helps. So thank you again for sharing that with us today. We don't have any questions in the Q&A. I always have lots of questions. So I'll ask people to pop those in there if they do have any that they want to ask to Sonya. But one of the things that I'm curious about, and maybe you can just talk a little bit more about, and I think this is something that's, you know, that can be fascinating to others as well, is that we've had some of these works for a long time. Some of these works are old. You know, how often are we uncovering new stories about these works or finding out new things? And like, is the research ever done?
No, absolutely not. I know that in some organizations, curators have a lot of time and space to do this type of research. Sadly, we just don't at a medium-sized organization, as you know. But when I'm showing works or programming and works in an exhibition, that gives me the time to do it and an excuse to do this kind of research. But a lot of this research has been existed since we first received these paintings, right? They're done when we acquire them. So I continue that tradition that when we get new acquisitions, we're ensuring that the file is full of documentation and information about the work. But no, I would love to do this type of research all the time. It's so much fun. And there's still some mysteries that I'm like, you know what? I bet you we could dig more into that and find out.
Yeah, it'd be nice to have like a list of mysteries.
Yes.
And then like set ourselves a task of maybe uncovering a mystery a year or something to then share. It'd be super fun. And it, you know, I think they're just like anything, was probably more information when we take something into the collection than there would be 20 years from now. The Doris McCarthy portrait stories they're great. I love the tire marks. I didn't know that one. It was amazing.
I know, and I really wanted to get a picture of the back of the work, but I obviously couldn't. But we need to do that because I think people just need to see that visual connection of, wow, a car really ran over this canvas.
And it survived. Yeah. I think especially with the mural that was in the kitchen too, like seeing some of those things in situ, it just gives you a different understanding of things. As we're used to, which is really great. Absolutely. It's really great. The other thing that I'm curious about, because you know, art has obviously been a passion of yours for a long time. I'm just wondering if there's the whole storytelling side of things. Is there a work that really sort of sparked that passion for you, that you sort of go back to as like that was the story that I really got into or got behind? Or
well, I think that funny enough, it was the Emily Carr painting, because when I did my internship at the RMG eons ago, I did a condition report of that painting. And that was my first experience of really looking so carefully at a work and having this whole other experience of how artists are just so incredibly talented and wanting to know more about a work. So it started off as more about wanting to know more about process, but then kind of shifted to inspiration. And all that information was already in the artwork file. And I remember just digging through it and poring over it as an intern, just like, wow, this is a really important work that is here in Oshawa that is such a seminal work to the story of Emily Carr. And so, yeah, I remember that experience of, it was started off with just looking at a painting with magnifying glass, and then shifting to wanting to know more about the story of, first of all, it was how we have this. and then shifting to where the inspiration came from, and the story of Emily Carr in general.
Yeah, how are we so lucky?
Right.
For sure. There's obviously lots of stories behind, all the works in our collection and any work of art. Where do you sort of point people when they're like, I want to know more about the stories behind? Like we have permanent collection information on our website, and I've added a couple links in the chat too to Virtual RMG and Painters 11. But when people are like, I just want to know more, I'm thirsty for more of this, where do you send them?
Well, usually in regular times, they can book an appointment to do research. We've got an incredible Canadian art library that has, and also the Joan Murray artist files that have so much wonderful research materials for the public to access. But I did get the same question not too long ago, and the importance of capturing these stories that are in people's heads and that sometimes might be down on paper but in piecemeal, and collecting it all and making it available and accessible to the public. And that's part of this interpretive consolidation project, pardon me, that I'm interested in doing, because it's not just me that's doing research on the collection, it's our learning and engagement department. They do such incredible research too, and it's important to capture all that stuff into the files but also make it available to the public. But if someone just wanted to find out more, I'm always happy to hear from the community about the collection, and I can direct them to give them more information.
Amazing. Amazing. Thanks, Sonya. I think it's interesting too that we often as a team tend to pick up on the same works that inspire us, which is kind of fun.
Yeah.
So one question here for you. So if you could meet in person, so we'll imagine we're not in this virtual world, an artist represented in the collection who is no longer with us, and ask them about their work, who would it be and why?
Interesting. That's such a good one. Love that question. And I don't think there's just one. There's so many. But if I'm going to base it on ones that I've mentioned today, I would. I know I didn't show her work, but Isabel McLaughlin is an artist that I would love to meet in person. And kind of she knew everybody and was connected, and she probably has some amazing stories to share. But in terms of like meeting someone, I think Harold Towne would have been really interesting to meet. He was such a character that you can see the character through his work. And so I would love to make that actual personal connection between meeting him and seeing and hearing these stories about him. That would be really fascinating. But that's just based on people that we've talked to about today.
That's fair. That's fair. Is there one like you didn't talk about today that you're like,
there's so many in the collection. Oh goodness. It's like that dreaded question that curators get, like, what's your favorite work in the collection? Or,
choose your favorite child.
Oh, I know. It's hard because my brain just goes like this because there's just so many amazing works and incredible artists in the collection. But yeah, those are two examples that I think people can relate to from today.
Yeah, for sure. I think it'd be fascinating to have a conversation with Isabel McLaughlin, just because of how generous she was and how much she, loved the Oshawa community, and just her story is so fascinating.
And people who have previous employees at the gallery, like Linda Jansma, who was the curator for many years, knew Isabel McLaughlin personally. Mm-hmm. So I've also heard those stories. And so there's that kind of like, oh, I really wish I'd met her, because I feel already kind of connected to her.
Yeah. Amazing. All right. Any more questions from the crowd, or Sonya, anything that's come to mind that you're like, I didn't share this and I should have?
I don't think so. There's honestly, this was just a very wide example of works in our collection, and we have such an incredible collection, and I always feel like I'm picking and choosing. It's very hard. I know that I do that as a curator. But I mean, for these type of talks, that if anyone's curious about a particular work in the collection, they can always reach out to me.
Amazing. Mm-hmm. That's great. I really appreciate it. And I think it's fun sometimes just to see the heavy hitters, as you put it. I've just for everyone who's with us, I've put a quick link to a survey that the Canadian Automotive Museum kindly put together for us, so we could start to collect some data and information from folks who are attending these culture chat sessions. So if you're able to click through to that link and fill out the survey, we'd really appreciate it. And do want to thank Sonya again so much for sharing her insights and her great knowledge with us today, and to all of you for attending. And just invite everyone to ensure that you have every Friday at noon booked in your calendar until May 28th for Culture Chats at lunch. Next week, the Oshawa Museum will be recognizing Asian Heritage Month in their talk, Chinese Canadian History and Oshawa Perspective. This talk is going to explore the history of Asian immigration in Canada that can be traced back to more than 150 years ago when Chinese workers arrived on the West Coast and joined the workers to build the Pacific Railway in the mid-19th century. Asian Canadians not only physically helped to build Canada, but also culturally enriched its diversity. The talk itself is going to focus on the long and at times very difficult history of Chinese immigration to Canada from the perspective of local families and their experiences. So I know I'm definitely going to be signing up for that one as I continue to learn more about the Oshawa community. That's a really, really important story. So I hope you all can come back. You can also visit the RMG website and follow the Culture Chats link to join any program that comes up. There's no registration required. We hope you have a wonderful weekend and take care. I know it feels very wintry out there right now, but I have high hopes for a spring feeling weekend. So hope everyone has a lovely time.
Thank you so much, everyone. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Sonya. Take care, everyone.
You guys.
Bye.